Chapter 1, 21 Rue Lafitte. For close to 170 years, the most important address in French banking was a building at 21 Rue Lafitte in Paris. It was the headquarters of a bank founded by one branch of the Rothschild family, and by the time it reached its historic peak in the late 1800s, the capital sitting inside that building was worth close to 17 million pounds. Converted into today's money, that figure comes out to somewhere around $2 billion, held entirely by one private banking house, run by one family at a moment, when most of Europe still moved its money by horse and rail. That fortune took 5 generations to build. It took the French government a single afternoon in February of 1982 to take it away. This is the story of Guy de Rothschild, the man who spent his adult life rebuilding that bank from almost nothing after it had already been stolen from his family once, only to watch the French state hand it back to the public for a fraction of what it was worth, and walk away from the family business for the second time in his life. It is also the story of a small, overlooked loophole that let the Rothschild name survive in banking anyway, even after the specific bank his family built was gone for good. Chapter 2. 5 Brothers, 5 Cities. To understand what Guy de Rothschild eventually lost, you first have to understand how strange and deliberate the whole Rothschild banking system was from the very beginning. In the early 1800s, a Frankfurt moneylender named Heir Rothschild sent his 5 sons out to 5 different European capitals, Frankfurt, Vienna, Naples, London, and Paris, and instructed them to build banks that answered to nobody outside the family. It was, for its era, one of the first genuinely international financial networks in the world, coordinated by letters and couriers moving faster than most governments could manage their own affairs. Nathan Rothschild built the London house into a power that helped finance Britain's war against Napoleon, a role so central to the family's early reputation that conspiracy theories about Nathan profiting from advanced knowledge of the outcome at Waterloo have circulated for 2 centuries since, regardless of how thin the actual evidence for them is. James Rothschild built the Paris house, founding what became known as de Rothschild Frères in 1812, and within a few decades it had become one of the dominant financial institutions on the European continent, financing railways, government loans, and industrial expansion across France. By 1878, less than 10 years after James's death, the capital of that Paris house alone had grown to nearly 17 million pounds. There was no shareholder register, no board answering to outside investors, no public listing of any kind. It was a private family partnership, and Mayor Amschel had been explicit in his own will that the business should pass between male heirs and belong to his sons exclusively. That structure, more than any single deal or decision, was what made a Rothschild bank different from an ordinary bank for the better part of 2 centuries. Chapter 3. How fast the money actually grew. The growth of that Paris house is worth walking through in real numbers, because the pace of it explains why the family became a byword for wealth across the whole of Europe within a single lifetime. According to the bank's own surviving records, the capital of the Paris house James Rothschild founded stood at around £55,000 in 1815, the year Napoleon was finally defeated at Waterloo. By 1852, roughly 1 generation later, that figure had grown to something over £3.5 million. By 1878, another generation on, and just 10 years after James's own death, it had reached nearly £17 million, a figure that in today's money works out to somewhere in the neighborhood of £2.5 billion. That is not slow, careful, generational wealth accumulation of the kind an ordinary family business manages. That is a fortune roughly tripling and then quintupling across successive 25-year stretches, built almost entirely on government lending, railway financing, and the kind of cross-border coordination between 5 separate national branches that no ordinary banking family of the era could match. The Rothschilds even adopted a shared family symbol, 5 arrows bound together, representing the 5 original brothers Mayor Amschel had sent out from Frankfurt. A visual reminder baked directly into the family crest that the whole enterprise depended on staying unified across borders rather than splitting into rival, competing houses the way so many merchant families of the period eventually did. Chapter 4. The brother who went to England first. While James was building the Paris house that Guy de Rothschild would eventually inherit, his older brother Nathan was already proving just how far the family's coordinated network could reach. Nathan moved first to Manchester, England, to set up a textile trading business, then relocated to London and established what became N.M. Rothschild & Sons, a bank that is, remarkably, still operating under a version of that name today. Nathan played a genuinely important role helping finance the British Army's campaign against Napoleon, a contribution so significant to the family's early reputation that it also produced one of the oldest anti-Rothschild conspiracy theories still circulating 2 centuries later. The claim that Nathan somehow profited from advanced knowledge of the outcome at Waterloo by rushing news of the British victory back to London before anyone else. Historians have found little solid evidence for that specific story, and it has been repeatedly debunked as an anti-Semitic myth that has followed the family for generations regardless of the facts. What is well documented is that Nathan and his daughter Louise Rothschild used a meaningful share of the family's early London fortune to fund the construction of synagogues and Jewish free schools across Europe. An early and consistent pattern of philanthropy running alongside the banking business that would repeat itself in nearly every branch of the family for the next 2 centuries. Right through to Jacob Rothschild's 20th century work chairing Britain's National Gallery and funding restorations of historic country houses like Waddesdon Manor. Chapter 5. A Family Stripped Twice. Guy de Rothschild was born in Paris in 1909, the son of Baron Edouard de Rothschild, and he grew up assuming he would eventually run the family's Paris bank the way his father and grandfather had before him. The Second World War nearly ended that assumption for good, and in a far more brutal way than any bank nationalization would manage decades later. When Germany occupied France in 1940, the collaborationist Vichy government stripped Guy's father and uncles of their French citizenship, expelled them from the register of the Legion of Honor, and seized nearly everything the family owned inside France, publicly declaring that the Rothschilds had abandoned French soil rather than admit the truth, that they had fled an invading army that would have destroyed them for being Jewish. Guy escaped through Spain and Portugal to reach his parents in New York, then turned around and joined the Free French forces to fight his way back into the war, rather than sit it out from safety. In March of 1943, the cargo ship carrying him back toward Europe was torpedoed and sunk in the Atlantic, and Guy spent 12 hours in the freezing water before he was pulled out alive. He went on to serve on the staff of a general at Allied headquarters near Portsmouth as the war ground toward its end. When Paris was liberated in 1944, the family's seized property was returned to them, and Guy de Rothschild set about doing something that, looking back, seems almost implausible. He rebuilt the bank nearly from the ground up, at a moment when most of Europe's old aristocratic money had been permanently gutted by the war. Chapter 6. The Bank Guy Rebuilt. Over the following 3 decades, Guy de Rothschild modernized the Paris house in ways his own father would barely have recognized. In 1961, he took over as chairman of Metal, a mining and industrial conglomerate in which the family held a substantial stake, expanding its holdings into Société La Nickel in New Caledonia, and later into a Chilean lead, zinc, and copper operation called Peñarroya, along with a mining company called La Compagnie de Mocta specializing in iron, manganese, and uranium. When French banking regulation changed in the mid-1960s, ending the old legal distinction between deposit banks and investment banks, Guy restructured the century-and-a-half-old partnership de Rothschild Frères into a modern limited liability company in 1967, renaming it Banque Rothschild. His appetite for expansion put him on the cover of Time magazine in December of 1963, in a story that described him as having taken over the family bank during the disorder of war and defeat and transformed it from a passive steward of the family fortune into an aggressive modern banking operation. By the late 1970s, that transformation had paid off. The Paris business employed roughly 2,000 people and posted an annual turnover of around 26 billion francs, worth close to $5 billion at the exchange rates of the day. Guy de Rothschild had done, across 3 decades, something almost nobody manages even once in a single lifetime. He had rebuilt a family fortune that fascists had tried to erase entirely, and he had done it well enough that the Rothschild name meant something serious in French finance again. He stepped back from the bank's day-to-day chairmanship in 1979, handing control to the next generation, believing reasonably enough that the worst chapter of the family's modern history was well behind him. Chapter 7, the telephone call, in February. Then came 1981. François Mitterrand was elected president of France that year on a socialist platform that explicitly promised to nationalize the country's major banks and industrial companies, and once in office, his government moved with real speed. In February of 1982, the French state seized 39 banks in a single sweeping legislative act, using a threshold pegged to total deposits to decide which institutions qualified, and Banque Rothschild was on that list. It did not matter that Guy de Rothschild had already stepped back from active leadership 3 years earlier. The bank still carried his family's name, still sat on the same Rue Lafitte, address the Rothschilds had occupied continuously since the founding of the house in 1812, and the French government simply took it, along with 38 other banking institutions across the country, as part of a broader nationalization program that also swept up major industrial firms. The compensation ultimately offered to the family came to roughly 150 million French francs. A figure that looked almost like an insult set against a business turning over 26 billion francs a year. Guy de Rothschild did not stay quiet about it. He wrote a letter to the newspaper Le Monde that has since become one of the most quoted lines in modern French financial history, describing himself as a Jew under Pétain and a pariah under Mitterrand, a line that captured, in a single sentence, the fact that his family had now been thrown out of French finance twice within one man's lifetime, first by fascists occupying his country, and now by an elected socialist government acting entirely within the law. He left for New York shortly afterward, discouraged, and for the second time in his life, without the bank his family had spent close to 170 years assembling. Chapter 8. What 150 million francs actually buys. It is worth sitting with that compensation figure for a moment, because it tells you almost everything about what actually happened. 150 million francs, split across the whole extended Rothschild family, amounted to a rounding error against a bank of that scale, and critics at the time argued openly that had Banque Rothschild remained purely a deposit-taking institution rather than modernizing into a broader investment bank, it might never have crossed the threshold that triggered nationalization in the first place. Once seized, the institution was stripped of the family name it had carried since 1812 and renamed Compagnie Européenne de Banque, borrowed from the name of a former mortgage subsidiary, and folded fully into the state banking system. For nearly a decade it operated under that borrowed name as a government-owned bank, until France began privatizing parts of its financial sector again in the early 1990s. In 1991, Compagnie Européenne de Banque was sold off entirely, this time to the British bank Barclays. The building at Rue Lafitte, the deposit base, the corporate relationships that 5 generations of one family had spent a century and a half assembling, ended up as a single acquired line on a British bank's balance sheet. That is the plain arithmetic of what Guy de Rothschild lost. Not a bad investment of his own making. Not a market crash brought on by his own mismanagement. Not a scandal cooked up inside the family. A newly elected government decided the bank should belong to the public instead of to the Rothschilds, wrote a check that covered a small fraction of its real value, and moved on to the next institution on its list.